I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular installment is one of a group on Joseph Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness. And here I'll be saying some things about Conrad's relationship to the beginning of a decline in confidence in the values and assumptions of the European Enlightenment. This is the first of two videos on this topic. So I want to begin today talking about modernity and what was happening in the first decades of the 20th century. And this first image I've shown you here shows the British possessions in Africa and Asia, also the French possessions in blue and in lighter orange, Portugal and its possessions. And Germany had some colonial holdings in Africa. They were about to lose those in World War I. So those were the colonial holdings around 1900. By the time of the Victorian era and in the first decades of the 20th century, some British writers and intellectuals were beginning to become disillusioned and disenchanted with the idea of the British Empire as civilizing the so-called savages. So these writers and intellectuals of the early 20th century were disillusioned and disenchanted with the confident and even arrogant assumptions of cultural superiority and moral righteousness of the late 19th century. And already Conrad was onto that in the 1890s. The editors say in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the narrator, Charlie Marlowe, suffers from a sort of a moral vertigo. Charlie Marlowe, the sailor, is quite comfortable on a ship. There, he knows what to expect. The conditions are limited. Everyone has to depend on each other out on the ocean, and it's a comfortable, familiar place to him. When he goes on land, though, he does not know whom he can trust. And at the end of this novel, he's going to have to go and tell the fiancée of Kurtz, the trader from the interior of Africa who has died. He's going to have to tell Kurtz's fiancée how he died and what he was really like at the end. And it's not a pretty picture. Marlowe always wants to tell the truth when he has to go tell this innocent young lady who's Kurtz's fiancée and who has this very high opinion of Kurtz's moral stature. He's going to have to tell her that he was all about greed, that he had gone crazy and was brutalizing the local population, and that his methods of bringing in the most ivory of any outstation were quite irregular and quite unethical, murderous, really. He can't do it. Marlowe says, "It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape if I told this lie, that the heavens would fall upon my head. But nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle." The editors go on to say, "In works like these, a voyage is undertaken into a vast, unknown, dark expanse. Those few who come out alive have seen too much, ever to be the same." That's the condition of modernity, facing an abyss when we no longer can depend upon the moral certitudes that had been taken for granted, certainly in the Middle Ages, certainly back to Beowulf's time, when a man was a man and a courageous act spoke for itself, certainly in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, when even though Chaucer will be satirizing the corruption in the church and some of the bad behavior of these clerical figures, nonetheless, everyone assumed that there was a God ordained this hierarchy under which society was ordered. There was no point in questioning it. It could be taken for granted. But with modernity, among such changes as the transatlantic exploration and the encounter with alien cultures, with totally different value systems, and with no knowledge of the tradition that the Europeans had been taking for granted, with the disruptions to the economic and political order that would come with urbanization, industrialism, those things begin to break down the assumption of obvious self-evident order, right, truth, morality that had been characteristic of the pre-modern society. All that might bring us in the 1880s to Friedrich Nietzsche. Some of you encountered Nietzsche before, perhaps. Such phrases as, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." But one of the most famous ones you probably heard was his observation that God is dead. I think what Nietzsche meant in saying that God is dead was that it's impossible in 1882, impossible to experience the divine in the same way that it could be experienced by someone living at Chaucer's time. In 1882, one could no longer take for granted that God had ordained this particular social order, that God had placed each person in this place in the social order according to his divine will, and that every part of this was self-evident, that one's life was laid out. It was Nietzsche's attempt to liberate humanity from what he saw as the false consciousness of adherence to a set of prescribed behaviors and attitudes and values that inhibited freedom and held people back. And he has a whole range of these things. Well, one, for example, Nietzsche criticized the concept of hope. That's one I can't quite agree on with him. My favorite Bible verse is from the 5th chapter of Romans, and it's in abbreviated form. Hope maketh not ashamed, for the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts. A kind of a hopeful assertion of, for me, the extension of charity and goodwill, even though sometimes it may seem foolish, really speaks to me. Nietzsche thought that hope was a bill of goods sold to people by the Christian church, beginning with St. Paul, continuing with St. Thomas Aquinas. That was always false hope. That was Nietzsche's critique. So the editors go on to say Conrad's tragic figure, Kurtz, and also George Bernard Shaw's comic professor Henry Higgin in Pygmalion represent two very different takes on this idea, building on Nietzsche's interest in showing how all values are constructed rather than given, at some level arbitrary, all truths being merely opinions, all social identities merely roles. I don't think that all truths are merely opinions, or that all values are merely constructs, but I will say that effectively, understandings of value are contingent, and they're only operative in a community, only operative when there's some agreement upon what is a value or what is the truth. If one holds a truth that is really the truth all by oneself, it doesn't have any effect. For a truth to be effective, there has to be some agreement. There has to be rhetoric. There has to be an argument of persuasion so that a community will accept this truth as a truth. That's where I'll end this webcast. But in another installment, I'll have more to say about the turn of the 20th century disenchantment with the moral certitudes of the Enlightenment tradition. Meanwhile, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.